Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at Jerusalem in the first century in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. We'll begin with a topographical map of Jerusalem. You see the outline of the Crusader walls. Those were not there in Jesus' day, but it helps us to orient to the city. You can actually have a do-it-yourself map. Notice if you take your left hand and point it with your palm toward you, but your fingers pointed down, you actually have a sort of a do-it-yourself map of the topography of the city. You can see looks a little bit like a thumb on the right side. This was actually David's city. And David's city was just that narrow strip along that ridge. And by using either your hand or the map that we're looking at, you see the valleys that surround the city. On the east side, you have the Kidron Valley. On the west side, you have the Hinnom, and the Hinnom actually wraps around the southern end and joins itself to the Kidron Valley. And then just on the west side of the city of David, you have the Tyropian Valley. This was a later designation, meant the Valley of the Cheesemakers, and points to Roman times when that portion of the city, that valley got its name. Here we're looking at a cross-section of the city. We start off with the Mount of Olives on the east to our right. That's the highest portion in the area. And then we move down to the Kidron Valley, a very steep valley. One of the things that the pictures do not show is quite how steep everything is. Then we move up to where we have the Dome of the Rock, also known as the Mosque of Omar. That was the place where the temple was located. The slight indentation downward into the Valley of the Cheesemakers wasn't very steep, at least not at that location. The further south it got, the steeper it went. And then moving up to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the western wall, the western portion of the city, at least in New Testament times. And then down into the Hinnom Valley. The Hinnom Valley, incidentally, was the place where they would throw out the garbage. And so the Valley of the Hinnom, the way you say valley in Hebrew is Geh, so Gehenna became sort of a byword for hell, because a place of burning and stinky things like that. On this model, we're going over to the Scroll Museum. That's where the model is located today. Again, we look at David's city, and we can see that oldest portion of the city. There is in David's city the spring for the, and we will notice the Gihon Spring, which is located, notice, outside the walls, and that had presented a problem, even going back to David's day and earlier when it had been a Canaanite city. And so in the days of Hezekiah had dug a tunnel going from the Gihon Spring all the way down to the Pool of Siloam, notice on our model. Now, when they made this model, they made it back in the 1960s. Since that time, a number of archaeological discoveries have been made, and they have not fixed the model, and that's probably unfortunate. It serves its purpose, but it would be nice if they updated it just a bit. So we have the Pool of Siloam, and there's actually two pools, an upper and a lower pool, because in 2004, the lower portion was discovered. We're going to look at that right now. But that Gihon Spring has a tunnel nowadays, ever since the days of Hezekiah in the Old Testament, cut a tunnel connecting the spring with this pool on the south side of the city. You can see the Byzantine pool where the connection was made. You can go through that, and here we are standing inside Hezekiah's tunnel. The water is flowing along our ankles because it's summertime, sort of the dry season. It looks like it's well lit. It's not. That's the flash of the camera. We were holding these little tiny these little tiny flashlights that barely put out no light at all. As I said, there are two sections. There are two pools, the upper and the lower pool. The upper pool has been there throughout all of the ages because the spring actually discharges through that pool. It served as the discharge for Hezekiah's tunnel. But the first century Pool of Siloam, the lower pool, was not discovered until the summer of 2004. There were some workers that were digging a sewer line. We'll see the piping in that in just a moment. And they were going to do some repairs on the sewer line, and they uncovered some old stones. And so they called in archaeologists Ronnie Reek and Eli Sucron, and they came up, looked at the stones, and they verified these are indeed going back to the 1st century. These are Herodian stones. And they cleared out the area. And this pool was one that was mentioned in John chapter 9 and verse 7, where Jesus sends a blind man to go down and wash in the pool of Siloam, and he comes back up to the Temple Mount able to see. So here's that 1st century pool of Siloam. You can see the piping that our friends had been working on when they uncovered this. Here's the same pool. Notice you have the steps going down into the pool, but the rest of it has not yet been uncovered. You say, well, why not? And the reason is because there are private dwellings up top, and they don't want to give up their homes. And so the pool has only been partially uncovered. Here's an artist's conception of what it would have looked like in that day. Leading up from the area of the pool was also discovered a series of stairs. And at the time I took this picture, they were still just beginning to clear it out. It was not yet open to the public. It was under lock and key. But today they have cleared out this stairway. It leads all the way up to the base of the Temple Mount. And we can imagine our blind friend stumbling down these stairs, walking down these stairs very carefully, washing in the pool, and then coming back up the stairs as he returns to the Temple Mount to meet the one who has given him his sight. And so we have David's city. But if we move to the west, we have on the other side of the valley of the Cheesemakers, the Herodian Valley, we have the lower city. Notice the buildings here are of a smaller nature. This was the poorer section of the city. And then moving continually to the west and to the north, next we have the upper city. This is where the upper class lived. The high priest would have had his home here. And we have on the far western end the Palace of Herod. The Palace of Herod had at its northern section 3 towers. They had been named, one of them was called Pharsalus. Faisal had been the brother of Herod the Great, the Hippicus, and the Mariamne. Mariamne is supposed to have been the most beautiful tower, named after the wife of Herod the Great, but the wife that he had executed when he discovered a plot against his own life. If you go to Jerusalem today, you can see what is called David's Citadel. It's named after David. David wasn't actually in this place. And it serves as the basis of one of these towers. We're not entirely sure which tower it is, but the foundations still remain there today. Now, moving to the north side of the city, we were looking at it from the south. This time our perspective has changed. And we're moving to the north side of the city, and we can see the marketplace gathered around the area. You can still see the temple. That sort of gives us our bearings, and the fortress Antonia. And north of the marketplace, in our foreground, was the new city in the first part of the 1st century. In the days of Jesus, the new city did not have a wall around it. So the wall around the marketplace was the northernmost section of the walled part of the city. By the time we get to 66 AD, just before the siege that would result in the fall of Jerusalem, that new city now had been surrounded by a wall, but it wasn't that way in the days of Jesus. Here we're looking at the palace of the Herodian Palace. It had 2 different sections in it, 2 wings you could imagine. And this would be the place where Herod Antipas, since he was one of the Herods, he would come if he was going to stay in Jerusalem. He might stay at the Herodian Palace. But not only him, also the governor. It was large enough to accommodate both Herod Antipas and also the governor, Pontius Pilate. And so the trials of Jesus no doubt took place here in the Herodian Palace on the west side of the city of Jerusalem. Notice again, you can see the three towers in the distance, and then off to the left, you see the Herodian Palace. But our attention now is going to come to the Temple Mount. You can see to the right, the Fortress Antonia that overlooked the Temple Mount. But the Temple Mount was almost as if it was its entire fortress itself, although it had way too many gates to be a fortress. Now, we're swinging over to the west side of the Temple Mount for this picture, and notice this area, this wall, the western wall, and the part that I've blocked in, the part that I've enclosed, is the part of the western wall that is visible today when you go to Jerusalem. Notice the section of the western wall that's visible originally went down much lower, went a good 60 feet lower than the present ground level. It has gradually filled up over the last 2,000 years to make it much higher. And it originally went much higher than it goes today, as you had this big giant wall that surrounded the temple complex. And so what we're going to do is zoom in on, notice you have a stairway leading up to a bridge, and we talked about that stairway that led all the way down to the Pool of Siloam. But now we see that it came up to this bridge over an arch and into one of four gates, and you can see some of the gates right here. On this picture, you can see three of them. We'll be looking at those. And this was a gate that led up to the Temple Mount. You can still see part of that archway. It butts out from just the ruins of that butt out from the wall of the Temple Mount. And remember, this was the lower part of the arch, so up on top of that, higher than that, would have been this bridge, the arch of which supported that bridge as they would make their way into the Temple Mount. Here, let's get a closer view of the arch. You can see it from the south looking north, and then we'll swing over. From the north side, you can still see the rubble of the retaining wall that has broken down. The rubble remains. It's been sort of pushed off the side so you can actually walk past that, but it still remains in place. In that rubble was found a stone with some Hebrew markings on it. It says, "To the place of trumpeting," and actually the last word is for the announcement. Apparently what they would do, and we have other Jewish writings that talk about this, every morning as the sun was just about to come up, someone, perhaps a priest or a Levite, would go up to this place on the very pinnacle of the temple, and he would look to the east, and as the sun first began to shine over the Mount of Olives in the east, he would blow the shofar, he would blow the trumpet, announcing that worship was about to begin and that the morning ceremonies could now go underway. They could now begin. Here we're looking at the western wall, and remember the ground level at the western wall originally went 60 feet lower, and now notice as you can see the very large stones on the western wall, but then as you move up, the stones get much smaller. The smaller stones are from the later Crusader period as the wall began to be repaired and added to. But originally that went much, much higher. And of course you can see the Dome of the Rock in the background. That's going to be our reference point anytime we're looking at the Temple Mount. So we have the western wall. Again, this is the portion that you can see today. It originally went much higher. It originally went much lower. And notice there is a second gate. We've already looked at Robinson's Arch, but there's a second gate that only a portion of it would be visible today. We're going to go now and look at the western wall. Notice again the stones that make up this. You have the men's side on the right, on the north side portion of the western wall. Go to the southern portion, and that portion today is reserved for women. And As we go to that women's section, we're going to see a lintel. It barely sticks out from a existing uh, structure that's there today, and it goes. Remember, it originally went underground another 60 feet. This was known as It's known today as Barclays Gate. He's the one who noticed it and cataloged it, and so we name it after the modern day discoverer. Back in that day, let's zoom in on that. We're going to notice over on the right, and we see the place. You can still see the lintel, but here's an outline of where the gate would have stood in that day, well below ground, part of it behind the modern existing structure today. And it was known back in that day as Coponius's Gate, the Gate of Coponius. Now let's go back to our model. Notice the gate, and the gate, even though today it's far below ground, there were steps that led up to it, because even from where it stood, the ground level of the Herodian Valley was lower still. And so there were steps that led up to the gate, and then you would go through the gate and up further steps to bring you up onto the Temple Mount. Now let's move to the southern wall of the temple. This was perhaps the main entrance. The most broad steps that led up to the Temple Mount came from this area. On our model, you see two sets of gates. Two gates on the left and two gates on the right. That's actually in error. These were known as the Hulda gates. They had not yet uncovered them. They knew about them, but they hadn't uncovered them when they made the model. And when they cleared off the rubble from this area on the south wall of the Temple Mount, lo and behold, they found not two but three arches. Notice the 1, 2, 3. You can see them. The gates are blocked up, but you can see the outline of the gates, the Hulda gates. It was 3 on the right and 2 on the left. And of course, this was how it was described in ancient records. And so we'll give the model the benefit of the doubt. It shows 2 and 2, but remember, it was 3 on the right, 2 on the left. Now, as you made your way up through to this area, you would have places where there would be pools for ceremonial washing. Let's change models. Now we're going to the model that exists today at the Holy Land Experience in Orlando. I'm making this recording in the year 2020. It might be that by next year, I've heard that they're selling the area and the model might either be taken down or moved to a new location. I don't know what's going to happen. A wonderful model. Notice how the model has it correctly, the 3 gates on the right and the 2 on the left, but also depicts 2 buildings, each with a gray roof, one that is between the 2 sets of Hulda gates and one off to the left just a bit. And these cover the mikvot, that is the pools for ceremonial washing. You had his and hers, one for the men, one for the women, because before worshipers could go up to the temple complex, they had to go through a ceremonial washing to make themselves ceremonially clean. Here is one of those mikvot that is on the south side of that temple. There are a number of them that have been uncovered. And now we're in the Valley of the Cheesemakers. Again, just to refresh our memory, you can barely see 2 of the Hulda gates on the right, and then Robinson's Arch. And, we need to mention a third gate. There's actually 4. A third gate that ran across the aqueduct that brought water to the temple, and so there was a third gate that joined from that, where you didn't have to go all the way down into the valley and come up the other side if you were coming from the west side of the city. Now, underneath the southern portion of the Temple Mount is an area that has been nicknamed, going back to the days of the Crusaders, Solomon's Stables. It was never used as stables, except maybe by the Crusaders, who might have brought their horses here. And what Herod the Great had done, he had actually, these are Herodian stones. You can see from the outline of the stones. You get to recognize these after a while. He had actually elevated the southeast corner of the Temple Mount to bring it all up to a level area, and this is a portion of that which held up that portion of the mountain. Moving now to the eastern side of the wall of Jerusalem, here we see the eastern gate. We're looking at the eastern gate from the Temple Mount itself. Zoom in. You actually have to go down to the entry to the eastern gate. But the gate that you're seeing when you look at the eastern gate does not date back to the days of Jesus. That's a Crusader gate. That's from the Crusader period, and it's actually above the old level of where the gate was. A number of years ago, there was and notice on this chart, the part that is in brown, that's below ground. What you're seeing in the light gray, that's what you can see from the ground level today. And a number of years ago, the rainwater had eroded some of the landfill there, and a tomb collapsed, and the people looked down into it, workers who said, gee, that could be dangerous. Somebody could fall into that. We want to cover that back up. But before they did, they looked down into it, and they could see the upper arch of the gate that goes back to the first century. And so immediately below the eastern, sometimes they call it the Golden Gate, immediately below that is where the gate was in the days of Jesus. Which, again, remember that the areas have, thanks to erosion and runoff, it's gradually built up over the years. And the topography has somewhat changed. Again, to get our bearings, we're coming back to the western wall. Notice the arches that you see on the lower left-hand corner of your photo. These only became visible in 1967 when the Israelis liberated the city of Jerusalem. There were structures in front of those, and they pulled them away, uncovering these arches, known today as Wilson's Arch. Again, we can see the Herodian stones. Notice how each block is outlined, where it's cut around with a very ornate rim. Some of these stones have been weathered thanks to the 2,000 years of snow and sleet and rain, and it's taken its effect on that wall. However, if we go down through Wilson's Arch, we come to a portion of that western wall that has been protected from the elements in all those generations. So let's make our way under Wilson's Arch through that area. Today, it's an area that's used still for prayer and reading the scriptures, especially when it's raining or snowing or there's inclement weather outside that would preclude the worshipers from gathering. As we follow that to the north, we're following Wilson's Arch to the north. You can begin to see how huge this arch actually was, that carried a bridge and an aqueduct to the Temple Mount. And yet, as we follow that way up north, we're going to see the very large Herodian stones. Some of these stones are perhaps as long as 30 feet long and looks to be about 5 or 6 feet high. Here I'm standing next to one of those, and they have been protected by from the elements in all these years. So there's very little weathering that is evident upon those stones. Now we move up to the top of the Temple Mount, and of course the very first thing we see is the Dome of the Rock. It's named that because if you are able to go inside, and nowadays only Muslims are allowed to go inside. I've actually got a Christian friend who was allowed to go back in the 1960s, not only to the Dome of the Rock, but there's a cave underneath of it. We're not going to be able to go and look there. But it's called the Dome of the Rock because the highest point on the mountain is on the Temple Mount is right here. The bedrock and the Dome of the Rock is actually built all around it. Down to ground level, you can see how there's a protective railing that's built around the actual rock, and it's here very likely where once stood the Holy of Holies. So let's come back, get an artist's conception of the entire area. You can see the Hulda gates down at the bottom of our screen. You would come up through the Hulda gates to get to the Temple Mount if you're coming from that south main entrance. There were entrances on all four sides. So we've so far been looking at the west, the south, and the east. There were also entrances from the north, including but not limited to that Antonia fortress. And on the south and north sides, there were also these mikvahs, these ceremonial washing pools. These were probably the two main entrances, but especially from the south, because that one you were coming up from David City. Notice once you get onto the Temple Mount, there is a low wall that surrounds the inner temple complex. Not the high wall, but the low wall stood about 4 feet high, and with signs chiseled in stone, and we've actually found some of those signs in Greek, warning all visitors that no Gentile was allowed past this point. This dividing wall separated what we called the court of the Gentiles from the inner courts where only Jewish people could enter. Here we are standing in the we're on the Temple Mount now, standing in what was called the southern portico, the royal portico. It was named after Solomon, so they called it sometimes Solomon's porch or Solomon's portico. Looking out at the temple complex, you can see in the midground that low wall that surrounded it. So here we would be in the court of the Gentiles, but only a Jew would be able to go past that and into the inner courts. Here is the model at Jerusalem, and again you see the low wall that surrounds the inner courts, but then you would go up a further set of stairs because you're always going up. Remember, the Temple Mount is a mountain, so you're going higher and higher and higher the closer you get to the temple proper. To the north side, notice on the far right of our screen, you have the Fortress Antonia, named after Mark Antony, who had been the patron of Herod the Great, and it overlooked, much to the chagrin of the Jewish worshippers, that Gentile fortress, that military fortress, looked down into the temple area. But you can see the low wall and then the inner courts that led into the temple itself. Here we're looking in the foreground at the court of the women, and then from the court of the women there was a round staircase. You can see the stairs. If you count them, you'll see that there are 15 steps leading up to the Nicanor gates, beyond which would be the court of Israel, the court of the men, the great altar, and then the temple itself, the temple proper. You say, well, why were there 15 steps? Well, first of all, because it's higher. But in Psalm chapter 120 to Psalm 134, there are 15 psalms that are known as the Psalms of Ascent. And these 15 steps corresponded to those psalms. It would be here that worshipers would stand on the steps and perhaps quote Psalm 120 and then 121 and 122 and go through the Psalms of Ascent as they were coming to worship the Lord. We can imagine the Levites, the choir, standing on these various steps as they sing each of these psalms, inviting the worshipers to come through the huge Nicanor gates, named after the patron who had paid for them, Nicanor, and you can just see a portion of the altar where the sacrifices would be offered, and then further steps leading up to the temple itself. Here is Rittemeyer's nice drawing to bring the entire complex together, sort of give us a picture of all of the different gates. We haven't mentioned, there's one further gate, I don't even remember the name of it. You can go visit that gate, but today it's underground. There's a tunnel that you go through Wilson's Arch and you can make your way up to that gate. I did not include a picture, shame on me. Now, a number of years ago, a gentleman by the name of Ernest Martin, and frankly, I think he was a gentleman. He and I corresponded before his death. He had come up with a very outlandish theory, almost, I think of it almost as a conspiracy theory, although he didn't think it was a conspiracy, that the temple was not located on the Temple Mount. That's a little bit bizarre even to suggest, but that the temple had been located further south in a place in David City. And so you say, well, what was the Temple Mount then with all of these gates? And he had wanted to suggest that this was a Roman garrison. Now, there were some real problems with this city, the chief of which it wasn't based on any archaeology at all. And Josephus describes a fortress not just to the north of the temple compound, but only on the northwest corner. He says he's very specific to say where the Antonia fortress was located. As you can see in the picture, if the Temple Mount had instead been a fortress, it covered the entire area and beyond of the temple. And Josephus would have been contradicting that. Secondly, the size of the retaining wall stones. Josephus tells us that the retaining wall stones of the Temple Mount were in places, 30, 40, 50 feet, and that's what we find in the Temple Mount. So he perfectly describes those very large stones that we saw as part of the retaining wall for the Temple Mount. Thirdly, he describes the four gates from the west that we've looked at. You didn't have that many gates on a Roman fortress. In fact, Roman fortresses would typically have one gate on each side. And so Josephus describes the four gates that are there as part of the Temple Mount. And fourthly, and this is what Martin could never explain, perhaps he didn't know any better. I think that's the case. But they were mikvot on both the north and the south sides of the Temple Mount. You wouldn't have a mikvot leading up to a Roman garrison. And really, the biggest issue is the Temple Mount, where he wants to try to put it. There's nothing there. He actually has to pretend that there was a mountain there when there is no mountain. It's just part of that ridge. It's simply not big enough to have contained anything that he imagined. Now, that brings us to the last question. Where, in this entire complex area, where was Jesus crucified? If you ask anyone today, they'll probably point, first of all, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that has been a marked place for the last 1,700 years. It was in the 300s that the first edition of the church was formed. Here is a sort of a chart showing that church area, and what you see in red is the existing structure. What you see in the stripes is the area the way it would have looked in the first century, or at least in the third century, when the church was formed. And so the church covers the area that is thought to be, whether it really is or not, but it's thought to be both the rock where Jesus would have been crucified, the rock known as Golgotha, and it also encompasses an area of a tomb. But that area that is in the orange stripes, that's actually all been cut away to make way for the church. And so instead of leaving it the way it would have looked in the first century or even third century, it has all been covered and gilded. Let's take a look and notice you can see at the bottom of the screen there, you can see through that plexiglass, there is a rock. That's all that you can see of the rock of what they believe is what was Golgotha. It certainly doesn't give you any way to envision that area today. In the same way, they cut all the surrounding area away from the tomb, and instead they, over top of it, they constructed this chapel. And frankly, when Paula and I were there, we did not even go inside. Maybe to our detriment, but it was crowded and we decided not to. And as a result, when we were standing outside the chapel, we happened to notice on the far western side, there's a section where there are some other tombs that are located. Take a look at one of those other tombs. Now, my pictures on the inside didn't come out so well, but notice just to get into the tomb, you have to step down. That's very consistent with the description that we have in the in the Gospels, where in John chapter 20, Peter and that other disciple, they run to the tomb, and the other disciple gets there, and he has to bend over and look down into the tomb, and then Peter goes barreling right in. And you can see it's not meant for human habitation. It's meant for dead bodies to be stored. It's very narrow, and it's very cramped, and pictures inside don't come out all that well. Now, if you do go to Jerusalem, the other place you might want to visit is what's called Gordon's Calvary. It's named after Gordon. He had been to the Tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, and it doesn't look very pretty, doesn't really sort of take you back. And he began looking around Jerusalem, and on the north side of Jerusalem, actually to the north of the Old City, he noticed this area that if you use your imagination and maybe squint a little bit, you can say, gee, that looks a little bit like a skull. Could that be Golgotha? Now, I don't think it was, but if you go there, you certainly want to visit both Gordon's Calvary and Gordon's tomb, because there is a tomb located nearby. Let's see where these are on our model. First of all, just to get our bearings, there's the Herodian Palace. We talked about that palace with its two wings. One where Pilate might have stayed at the Passover. He was there when Jesus was crucified, and the other possibly where Herod Antipas might have stayed, which would have allowed them to pass Jesus back and forth and not take all day moving him from one end to the other end of the city. Just to the north of that, outside the old city walls, now you say, wait a second, there's a wall around that, but that wall on the furthest north side wasn't built in the days of Jesus. So that would have been outside the city gates. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, both Golgotha and the tomb would have been located in that area. Far to the north would be the location for Gordon's Calvary. Now, on our model, it doesn't quite give you a picture of how far north that is. So let's look at a map from the top down. Here we see a map of Jerusalem in the early 1st century, and we see the area of Golgotha. Remember that what you've seen in green, that part of the wall, was not added until later. This was added by Herod Agrippa I from 41 to 44, so it wasn't there in Jesus' day. That might be I'm not saying that's definitely the location, but it's the place that people have been pointing to for the last 1,700 years. And you say, well, where is Gordon's Calvary? Gordon's Calvary would be off our map to the north. It would not even make it onto the map. That's how far north it is. It's way up outside the city and quite a distance away. And so it's more likely that Jesus was crucified right outside the city gates on the main road where everybody would pass by. And so if I had to choose between the two, now of course it could be neither, but if I had to choose between the two, I think I would go with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But as I said, if you ever go to Jerusalem, visit Gordon's tomb, not because this is the place where Jesus was laid, because the tomb itself is actually predates. It's a tomb that's older than the 1st century, and Jesus was laid in a new tomb, so that's not the place. But it's a garden, and it will at least put you in mind. It's a wonderful place to go and meditate about how Jesus did die for our sins, that he was buried, and that he rose again. And so we can look at 1st century tombs. This is an example actually up in Galilee, a 1st century tomb with a rolling stone that would be rolled into place. And we can look at this and imagine what that tomb in which Jesus was laid, what it might have looked like. But remember, that tomb was emptied because Jesus rose from the dead. And the key takeaway that we want to have is that not where Jesus died, not where he was buried, but that he did die for us. He did die for sins, and that he lives today, a Savior that lives and will return one day in the future.